Welcome to Decoded, the podcast that decodes the design, technology, and experiences shaping our world and planet. I am Elisa Leñero.
And I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen. Together we explore the systems, behaviors, and technologies influencing how we live, work, and connect, from human interactions to the ecosystems we are part of.
Each episode is a conversation with technologists, designers, entrepreneurs, and everyday users. Join us.
Hi, welcome back to the show. I'm Saima Ahmed Christensen.
And I'm Melissa.
And I'm a professor of design engineering and innovation and director of Digit Lab, a research lab exploring design and digital technologies based in the University of Exeter.
And I'm a designer by training and currently rediscovering what design is in times where the world is challenged in many, many different ways, from the artificial intelligence revolution to the deep societal changes and massive ecosystem destruction. In today's episode, we will be exploring the theme creative technology, ethical AI, and other topics with our guest, Jude Pullen. He has been featured inventor in BBC's iconic Big Life Fix. Jude is an award-winning creative technologist, chartered engineer, and physical prototyping expert. He combines high-level strategy and an ability to make concepts tangible to validate and accelerate business opportunities. He is described as a diplomatic rebel and a powerhouse. His approach is to find the human story in technology to shape ideas mid-light. His ability to explain complex ideas simply or bold new ideas to children and C-suites with equal dedication, children being more difficult, we know that, has won him the IMEC-E Alexander Graham Bryce Imagineering Award. He enjoys working on high-risk and high-pressure projects that push the boundaries whilst challenging societal ethics. His clients include the NHS, Dyson, Lego, RS, NVIDIA, IKEA, Pentagram, and much, much more, and so are startups. And also, he has headlined events in the UK and Europe, and his TED Talk inspired many new client projects in the uncharted waters of AI and machine learning, and so much more. I can keep going, Jude, but I'm going to leave it there. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Should we start with AI, since we talk about AI, and right now AI seems to be kind of the topic?
But we might lose all the audience that as soon as you say AI, people are like, no, not more AI. So yeah, I would say I share the sentiment. Yeah, I would say I share the sentiment, and I gave a variation of some of the things I'm going to be discussing to a talk of young people at Disneyland Paris, alongside engineers who help create some of those experiences, as well as data specialists. So I called my talk, New Adventures in Ethical AI, which is a slight sort of nod to an REM album. And so I sort of felt that, we're at this point where anyone trying to put their finger on exactly what AI is or it means, it just feels like it's a bit of a moving feast. And as much as I think I could be extremely reductive and just say, it's a tool and it's what we do with it as humans, I think at the same time, this is why I like having conversations with people like yourself, because it's the intersection between, art, design, engineering, science. And I think this is why we need the arts to connect with the sciences, because I think the greatest value that art has, not just to, our society, but also to the economy, is to make sense of things. So I feel a lot of my projects actually, maybe this sounds a cheesy phrase, but I sort of say it starts with the art. And then that helps me understand what the value of what we're trying to do is. And I think one of the punchlines, and I guess I should briefly describe what the project was essentially to use AI to help optimize packaging. So if you've ever ordered something online and you've had something really, really small arrive in a giant box and you think, what on earth is going on here? Then the simple answer is that's a tremendous waste of money. The second answer, of course, is it's a huge waste of resources in terms of the planet. But the bit that you're left scratching your head with as sort of hopefully an empathetic designer of going, well, surely these big box, sort of retail companies wouldn't just want to leave cash on the table. Why are they doing this? And so, if you work with the presumption that they're not stupid, then it leads you to the conclusion that either things are very, very hectic, or there's something to do with the sort of machinations of how all these logistics come together. So the proposition, I sort of jokingly called it a sort of Tetris solution, in the sense that the Tetris game fits things together very, very nicely. And obviously we can provide some links below, because I'm trying to describe a very 3D thing just in words alone for a podcast. But the way I describe it is that there's a way that if you took this problem to a mathematician or computer scientist, it would be described as, that's the classic non-polynomial hard bin packing problem, which, if you're in that world, is very known and very understood. Basically, it requires a lot of compute, lots of crazy, maths that I'm not going to pretend to say that I understand. And on the other end of the spectrum is humans just trying their best. And what I've sort of jokingly called it is, we set out to not do hard, not do sloppy, but we called it NP medium, which is that what the ramifications of that mean is that we're taking the ability to pack boxes and do it in such a way that it isn't boiling the oceans with a vast amount of compute. And instead, it's trying to be as lightweight as possible. And this is something, I'm sure your audience is very tuned into, that obviously AI doesn't come for free. And I think we should be as responsible with it as possible. So this sort of project, I feel, is quite multifaceted. That, the alliteration very knowingly is that it was, people, planet, packaging, but also the bit that I feel, having worked in sustainability now for around 5 years, quite concerted effort, I kind of feel the last P is profit. You have to be able to sell in a sustainable project to any commercial entity by saying, this is going to make sense in terms of your bottom line. And I guess the tricky thing is, I could say idealistically, it's going to help it generate profits by being virtuous and all this lot, but we kind of know that's quite thin ice to walk on. So instead, P&L, the second term loss, I think that it's unequivocal that we're basically reducing waste of materials, and that reduces the burden on the company, but also the sort of weird saving grace of having got into this project for 6 months with RS and NVIDIA. We got into it, as you say, for all the right reasons, but then we realized actually some of the legislation is coming and companies will have to be compliant with this. So the fact that it becomes a business imperative as opposed to just a nice to have or a sort of corporate social responsibility, I think for me is why I like working at the fringes and at the cutting edge. It isn't just because it's cool to say I work at the cutting edge of technology. It's that genuinely I think that's where the uncertainty is. And effectively that means that's where the profits are for me as a freelancer, because if you're going to work on anything, work on a really difficult problem that people are willing to pay for, is how I see it. So for me, I like working at sort of difficult, taboo, or uncertain and high risk projects, and that for me just feels like it's a bit of an MO of how I get work.
Jude, can we just unfold that a little bit? So I know what NVIDIA is and RS is, but perhaps you could explain that for our listeners.
Absolutely.
And also, if we just take a step back, so if we just explain that first, and then we could just start talking through that actual process of what you did and how that ended up with what sort of solutions you ended up with, please.
No problem. So the process, as I said, it's quite a lengthy thing that I always take a bit of pride in writing up these things, as I think open source and sharing is a very interesting thing. So online at Design Spark, there's basically 10,000 words in 6 chapters of all the thinking behind this. But essentially, what we did was essentially look at all the different things that RS, who is a big electronics distributor, they ship from one warehouse operation, I should say, one distribution center. They ship over 1 million boxes a year, and that's just boxes. That's not including other things like padded mailers and envelopes and bags and pallets. So this is, a colossal problem. And if you consider that this is a multinational selling things all around the world, most people probably aren't familiar with RS if you're not in the engineering world,
Yeah.
but it's equivalent to like an Amazon for electronics, let's say, just to make it relatable. And so this is a sort of somewhat endemic problem of that if you want to ship things, how do you, not everything fits in a nice rectilinear square box. And so one of the things we realized is, can we use AI to tell people how to get as much stuff in the smallest box as possible? And I think one of the reasons it becomes an ethical discussion is that, does it automatically lead to a conclusion of, are we trying to replace humans with robots? To which the answer is absolutely not in the short term. For the simple
Can I?
reason, yeah,
So
sorry,
there's that's one part of the argument, but that's got really solid argument there because it wasn't being done. Right.
yes,
So we're starting with assuming, as you said, that humans aren't stupid, and
yeah,
that so there was something limiting the ability. So either it's the resources of the packaging, or the availability, or the pressure on time. So anything that's assisting and augmenting humans is another
yes.
way to look at it, is helping that process. Can we unfold what the AI is? Is this optimization, or is what type of AI is being used here?
So yeah, it's an optimization
Yeah,
essentially. So
yeah,
it's basically the fancy term that I came across, and I can't take credit for this. This was working with a very talented interaction designer called Brian Schwab, who I know from my Lego connections, and he basically introduced me to this phrase in computing called heuristics,
yeah.
which
Mm.
Yeah,
essentially to the layperson means trial and error. And actually, as
yeah,
a parent, and also my parents, worked in nurseries for 18 years, so I was familiar with this idea of children's heuristics. But what this is part of the reason I love working in AI is that the deeper I go down the rabbit hole of understanding how a machine perceives the world through inputs and outputs, the more sort of humility and awe I have for what the human brain and body does.
yeah,
So yes, to answer your question, it's an optimization thing. And I think the reason we found the heuristics very powerful is that we tried to get it to go through a series of what are sensible rules, which I would differentiate from AI, and that reduces the burden on this algorithm of having to play Tetris. So
yeah.
if we just essentially what you'd call brute force, if we just gave it the Tetris problem without any effort at all, we would waste a huge amount of energy and compute time. Whereas we try and do things like say, well, make sure you don't put a hammer with a box of light bulbs because it might break it, and
Right.
make sure you don't put a really long thing with a slightly wide thing, which then means you have a tremendous inefficiency because they're so dissimilar, the two things. So we go through a series of essentially quick sorting and filtering, and then we do, as I said, that optimization special thing that AI does, I would say, better than humans. And indeed, I took a test, and I would say I'm a little bit pride myself on being very spatially aware. It's, I think, one of the weird byproducts of being dyslexic. You're usually quite good at these things. But the computer, even just straight off the bat, beat me by 32% in terms of optimal packing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I was kind of blown away that I was genuinely trying to beat it. And
Yeah.
without even really refining the model, it was still doing a better job, even to the extent that, there's a bit of footage where Brian and me are looking at it, and my wife was filming it, and we'd thought there's an error. And then we checked it and we're like, oh my God, it does fit. So
And
it
how
was, sorry, go on.
and for these products, for example, how the AI works, like, is it, do you have to scan all of them, so then it kind of like gives you an idea of what is the material, or how do you label this product on what is the material, what is the weight,
Yeah,
what are the specifications? Because that's a massive, it's a project on its own,
absolutely.
and
And
there might be different pieces every time.
absolutely. So yeah, I won't quote the exact figures that RS have, but you can assume it's like 500 million type of components in their inventory. It's vast numbers of things. However, what happens is that when RS or any company, Amazon, or any of these sorts of companies takes an item and puts it on their system, they will have essentially the gross, which is the Z dimensions, and then possibly the product dimensions if it's needing to be more specific. It will also have the weight. It will have any material safety data. What sounds obvious to the sort of layperson is, well, surely if you've got all that data, it must all be accurate and it must all be really nicely formatted. And the realization, and I can say this not as a dig towards RS, is I actually attended a data IQ summit in Spain last year. And that was, honestly, I won't name names, but it was basically the elite of, chief data officers from around the world. And I think almost without exception, nobody was saying that, this is an easy thing to get into, because most companies, their data is fragmented. Mm-hmm. It's not centralized. And actually, it's just prone to sort of legacy errors. So you're completely right in saying there's a whole project in basically cleaning up your data before you even get out of bed and run an AI project. But I would say that
data wrangling. It's called data wrangling.
So it sure is. I think.
Yeah. And quite challenging. Many, so like you say, you've heard it in big companies, but I think that's a major challenge of most AI. Have they thought about, going back to Melissa's point, because in other settings, in medical settings, we've looked at, or not I've looked at other examples, other people working on, where they're using RF codes and scanning the products to identify, so to support medical surgery, to identify quicker what the objects are. An approach like that could be quite interesting, because I presume, being RS, that everything's catalogued. Absolutely. Or are you saying the materials aren't catalogued and it's a bit trickier?
No, so what's interesting is sometimes you can just have genuine mistakes where someone has said, yep, we've put a hammer on the system, and they've just imported the data from the supplier. But it could be that actually that data's out of date and that they've changed the design of the hammer. So it might be the same weight, but they might have changed the handle. And so, on and on and on and on, all these sorts of things would mean that if you wanted perfect data, you essentially need to sort of do a randomized trial, which is what RS has done, to uncover sort of what is the extent of the sort of fuzziness of some of the data. And I think what's reassuring is, obviously you can have data which is completely wrong, like someone has mixed up meters and centimeters, and you can detect that as an error, that it's just, a 25 meter long hammer is improbable. It's probably 25 centimeters. So you can do essentially logical tweaking like that. But as I said, the smaller things that can, of course, trip up the packaging situation if the human is busy trying to put something in and the data was wrong. So one of the solutions, as you alluded to, is that we could scan it. But the realization is that that isn't something that we needed to do every single time. That's something where you do once and then it's done. So it's a one and done calculation. And that's almost like a side project of almost policing all the things as they go down the conveyor belt. And it probably means that after a year, you will have essentially purged all of the erroneous things, because it will have sold one of them and took a scan of it at some point. But those things are quite, should we say, they're very labor intensive. They need a lot of oversight. But the good news is that I think as companies move into this more AI data-led paradigm, they're aware that they just can't put sloppy data in. Whereas in the old days, it didn't really matter if you're a centimeter out. Whereas nowadays, as this legislation of PPWR, which we can put links to if people are interested, you will basically be fined in 2030 if you ship more than 50% air. And so suddenly, I think what we're going to see is a sort of trickle back effect of suppliers and manufacturers having to tighten up on their accuracy, because they will incur penalties is the simple thing. So bit of carrot, bit of stick, as usual.
You're talking about the profits there. Like, I love how you said, like, people, packaging, planet, profits. That's kind of like more on the. So if we take out people and we talk about planet, packaging and profits, it's kind of like what we are discussing at this point, right? Like being more efficient with the packaging, better labeling, etc., which in turn it will result in sometimes loss of in losses, not in losses, but in profit, etc. What about the usage of AI And in the last MIT review, the last magazine that I got, basically it says AI power hungry. So we know that AI takes a lot of energy. So what is there about the use of, is it 30% that is saving on, you mentioned that the accuracy is like 30%, right, of AI?
Sorry, the accuracy is 30%. I'm not sure.
The accuracy is 30% versus for 30% more than what you guys were kind of distributing it.
Sorry,
So
yeah,
it's
you
more
mean packaging something by hand? I got a
exactly.
result that was 30% less efficient. Yes, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. So you're mentioning that, but how does that compare to the usage of AI efficiency or non-efficiency by using water and other resources to be using
Yeah.
AI? So I would just want to understand the planet and the people there by using AI. Is that like enough?
So I'll be honest, until we are able to sort of see the data at large, the thing that we're sort of trying to do, which I think is perhaps a little bit of a more sort of radical approach, is that a lot of when people think of AI, they think of it going across a bunch of servers and into the cloud. Now that sort of stuff, you will be able to get data on the energy use, the water consumption. Interestingly, a lot of companies are quite scared of that because when you say take your data and send it to the cloud, RS doesn't want to do that, and nor do most companies because it's extremely sensitive data. So I find it quite extraordinary that we're doing something called, essentially it's an edge computer, which just means it's locally doing the AI crunching, and it's doing on something which is basically drawing about 12 watts of power. So 12 watts is like an energy saving light bulb.
Yeah.
So that I feel, I haven't done a robust LCA analysis, but just, anecdotally, just observing it, you think if we can crunch essentially the vast number of products that RS sell and essentially do that locally on a piece of hardware which is drawing 12 watts of power, which will get more and more and more efficient because the more it processes, it doesn't just bin it, it uses it in future. So I think that's the bit that I would say I honestly haven't got a clean answer for. It's so many tons of CO2 and so many liters of water. But I think you can appreciate it's a completely different shift to just pushing things to cloud. And I think one of the problems is, as with so much in life, and we all know this as designers, if you create a generalized all-in-one solution, it is tremendously inefficient. Whereas if it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife is a lovely thing, but until you observe the sort of, the meta point that you're carrying around a load of tools which you didn't actually use when you went camping, whereas knowing exactly the task, if you're doing the exact task in a bespoke way, we've essentially tailor fit the algorithm to the hardware to the problem. So I would say, as much as I'm not saying this is a magic bullet and everything should be done edge compute, but I think there is something troubling about just pushing everything to the cloud and just sort of treating this as a sort of convenience. Because as we're seeing, without getting too political and into the news, it's not always comfortable just to be beholden to these, tech sort of monopolies, oligarchies, whatever you want to call it. But there's a huge amount of power that's centralized in a very few places. So by being able to say, okay, we still need to buy the hardware, that of course is beholden to companies like NVIDIA. But the ability to run things natively and really control your data, I do think that feels like an intelligent business choice when it is also looking through the lens of environmentalism, of by being bespoke, you're using less resource in doing it, and it allows you to be much more focused. So I think, the tailoring metaphor, I think, holds.
Yeah, Jude, we've done some work in Digit Lab where we, so look, a lot of our work is on data and AI, and we did work with lots of manufacturing companies across many sectors.
Yeah.
And the barriers that you've just unfolded are absolutely true. So because the solutions, general AI solutions, are often generic,
Yeah.
So you could say about design, you could say about manufacture, you could say about other commercially sensitive domains. Often you have to train your own localized large language models on your own data to make that relevant. So that's an investment. And there's the trust and privacy and commercial sensitivity issues which prevent sending data up to the cloud. So a lot of this data, and now we're saying data, but I mean the environmental data of using AI, so that water resources, of positioning of data centers, depending on who you listen to, sometimes you'll hear some debate saying that each search, an AI search, is 30 times more than a Google search, and others will say it's 10 times, depending on where you sit on the fence. That debate it's quite hard to go past it. So because there's the subtleties of how AI is being used.
Yeah.
And so I think this is really important to demonstrate. And where I personally sit, I embrace AI to solve global solutions while being wise about the ethics, whether it's privacy or the sustainability impact. And we also see directions like you've just talked about, edge processing, and also circular economy of data centers. That's the other direction of research that's happening to reduce consumption and think about the research. So it's quite hard to explain that. How do you meet reactions when people talk about AI in terms of sustainability? Do you see it that people are quite polarized around it?
Yeah, I think I think what's difficult is that, exactly that point of if an AI search is 10 times, let's just be on the generous side of those two statistics. Let's assume it's as little as 10 times a Google search. I think my pushback, and I think I've always held this stance, that it's very easy to point a finger and just say, oh, that big tech company is evil, if at the same time we're not doing anything about it as consumers. So where I'm going with that is if it is widely understood and widely publicized in the public, which let's hope these statistics become more like, what is it, Mike Berners-Lee's How Bad Are Bananas, that people have a quick reference of like, I've just done a GPT or a LeChat or a Claude Code, then they should have a sense of what the cost is. My challenge would be, is your query 10 times more useful than a Google search? In which case, I kind of feel the scales maybe balance themselves out. If you said to me, did I use, one of these Gen AI things to just do a sort of, cat on a vacuum cleaner mashup video, then sure, maybe as a teenager, that's just part of me finding out what's funny. And I think if you overhauled teenagers for everything that they did was stupid, then we'd be in trouble. And, if just because in my day, I wasn't running any fatuous GPT things, I was still throwing rocks at broken windows in old warehouses and stuff. So I think, part of me sort of feels like, kids aren't really the target here. I think it's organizations where you essentially have a mandate to be responsible to the planet. And I think that's what's been really good about working with RS is they began this journey from let's see what is the right thing we can do, and then understand the ramifications in terms of business to see how viable it is. And I do think that is, for me, a very progressive stance to try and do the right thing, but also just to be honest about the fact that the stuff that will get signed off will need to have an impact on the business's viability. So to quote my good friend Andy Carr, even sustainable businesses need to be sustainable, which I think is a perfect turn of phrase of the knife edge we're often walking along.
Absolutely. It's interesting. There was somewhere statistics of how, not statistics, a report on how ChatGPT is being used by the public. And it's interesting what you're saying about public awareness. Actually, it's being used as a Google. That's the most common search. So just looking for something very basic, well, and also recipes.
It's fair to say that you get it whether you like it or not. If I go to Google at the minute, not to single Google out, but I noticed that it will fire up Gemini irrespective of whether I ask for it.
Precisely.
Exactly. And I think we're still learning how to use it. I think we're still learning on how we're using the tool and what is it for, besides just asking questions or like recipes and so on. And I remember when I was when I first started using internet, and I was, I don't know, like 12 or 10 years old, and this was a long time ago. I remember that one of the, like, my email, my relationship with internet was to do my work, to do my homework, but also to send jokes to my friends through email. So of course, it's kind of like I was learning how to use email, and that way was, okay, this is a joke, and let me show you this joke. And she was sending me other jokes as well. So it's kind of like we're still learning on how to use it. And but yeah, I think it's a great way in which you are explaining, and I love the way that you're explaining design and how design is embedded now in AI, like how design mindset is helping to understand how to use a big tool like AI.
And I think that's the interesting point, is sort of how do we have a sense for right sizing the type of AI to the problem that we're trying to crack. So to the point, without repeating ourselves too much, the thing that we're trying to do for packaging, we're trying to run it on literally something which is like I'm trying to hold my hands up, basically sort of 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 5, roughly, and drawing 12 watts of power, yet is running a database of a multinational company through it. That's a very different thing to asking an AI a really interesting hypothetical question about what is the philosophical points of da 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 da, which is very sort of hallucinatory in a fun way. To give an example, as I realize that sounds very vague, one of my friends is introduced me to this technique of when you're trying to work out a creative problem, you prompt the AI to say, we're at a dinner party and we've got, Socrates, Lady Gaga, and you name all these other different people from history, and you say, and we're going to debate this thing. What is a hypothetical conversation that they might go through? And that's a sort of, I think that's using hallucinatory, to use the sort of pejorative that is often criticized at AI, of that it's just guessing. That the outcome for me isn't to write down what it thinks Socrates or Lady Gaga would have said verbatim and use that in my report. My point is I'm using that as a creative stimulus or trigger to go, I'd never thought about that tension between these two people. And so that now takes my creative process in a different direction. Now, going back to the environmentalism, if that is considered, a fatuous waste of resources, then I also have to be honest about the fact I don't even actually know how many books I've got in the house, but it's more than 1,000. And so that also uses paper, that uses trees. Going to the library in London still requires me to, do a bunch of stuff that consumes energy. So I think my point isn't to sort of hone in on AI and say it's just bad bar humbug. It's to say, to the point I made earlier, if I know that it uses 10 times more power, could I make my query 10 times more interesting or useful? Yeah. I think if we have that how bad are bananas test in our head, I do think that's the responsible way. As adults, I'm slightly forgiving teenagers and kids, because I do think that's just a time of life where we just shouldn't be too critical,
Yeah. I think we're still working out as a society how human and AI cooperation takes place, and where the role of AI is and where the roles of humans are, whether it's the general public in general life or in your everyday life, or in a particular domain, creative, manufacturing, whatever the domain. So we're still on that journey. But I wonder if we could take a slight shift. So provenance is another word that's used in training of AI, so often used to understand how an image has been adopted or adapted. That your cat on the Hoover example, for example. So the cat has to come from somewhere. So whose copyright that was, and tracing the origin all the way through. Now, you've been working with nature and technology on provenance of teaching. And so I wonder if we could jump all the way from there into your projects.
I'm hoping the audience will take a leap of faith that in some ways I'm both aware that, we might lose the audience, but at the same time, part of me is like the sort of audience that can take a leap from AI to monkeying around with clay, I think is my kind of innovators and people.
That's us.
Well, that's dyslexia. That's dyslexia, which I think is brilliant. They're like crazy connections. So yeah. Why not?
Exactly. So I guess what I've got here, obviously we can include photos and links, but I've got a little pot that I made, which if you notice is this lovely color of sort of London red brick orange, because it's taken from a London river, the River Ching. I should hasten to add, for anyone who's representing waterways and the environment, we took a very small sample because it was more of a philosophical thing, and also we actually did quite a considerable litter pick. We actually hauled an entire, I won't name the company, but a famous bookshelf out of the river, a massive flat screen TV, a bike, a whole wardrobe of clothes, along with a bunch of beer bottles and all sorts of other detritus. So I'd say as much as we extracted a couple of kilos of clay for the purposes of inspiring kids as to where provenance of their things came from, I think also we tried to leave nature in a better place than we found it, let's say. But to come back to this word provenance, the thing that rather fascinates me, and again for the nerds in the room, they might have got here that basically clay, its fundamental constituent is sand, which is known as silica. That also just, I rather poetically love the fact that it also is the formation of what becomes microchips as well. So I enjoy that little, sort of rug pull that we are using Stone Age, as it were, pre-Stone Age technology, to make our ceramics, which I think ceramics are often overlooked. Because at school we're taught about the Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, but actually the ceramics run through that for the very simple reason we probably wouldn't have civilization and agricultural capability without the sort of codependence of pottery. Because quite simply, if you weave a wicker basket or something, you might be able to keep it off the floor so that the mice don't get it, but you won't stop the mold and the damp getting to it. And so ceramics has almost single-handedly transformed our ability to stockpile things, which radically changes society from a hand-to-mouth subsistence model to something which we now know as trade and commerce. So, I'm not going to pretend to pass off what is extremely well elaborated in Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, which I'm sure many of the audience are familiar with. But teaching kids a sort of simplified version of that is something really fascinating. And indeed, it was a fortunate coincidence that I just bought my son the 3 volumes of the illustrated *Sapiens*. My son's about 9, and so I was reading this and then realizing I was doing this clay project in parallel. And I just, I've got one of the kids' little horses that they made, or it's actually a unicorn. What was I thinking? Of course, it's a unicorn. And as you can see, you can glaze it and make, I'm just showing a pot here with a lid that has a sort of slightly deeper brown color of the glaze. And that was to illustrate the point that we can make functional things as opposed to just art. And so, I don't know whether I mentioned, but I'm currently living in Walthamstow, which is also home of William Morris, and I'm probably going to butcher the phrase, but
there's also their house. It's also in Hammersmith.
Yes, in Hammersmith where we are. So
there you go. So, but his phrase of along the lines of have nothing in your house that you know not to be beautiful or functional or practical. Is it? I can't remember the exact quote, but I thought that was a really nice thing as a Walthamstow kid to basically say we are enacting some of this heritage, which you've probably been told about because you live here. But actually, what does that mean? What does the person mean to say this thing has aesthetics and, functionality, form and function? And I think, if you take something like, wood, you've got to grow a tree. It's going to take too long. If you take something like metal, it's too dangerous for schools because most schools aren't going to refine their own metal. And so I thought clay was a perfect thing to sort of show that it is both extremely ancient and extremely modern in terms of its utility. And so this big fancy word of provenance, I think is something that if kids grow up with this idea of when I take something and purchase it, it has by definition meant that something has been extracted, not just materials, but also labor, knowledge, there's geopolitics. And so, to quote Mitch Resnick of MIT, as you mentioned, his point about having low floors, high ceilings, wide walls with teaching, I think clay's a really lovely thing to talk about, because it essentially can be explained to, as I've done, primary school kids, but I can also have a conversation with materials scientists at a level which is PhD. And of course, the journeys in between that are myriad. And so, yeah, I've grown up with making pots all of my life, and it was one of those odd things that the irony is I felt compelled to do the project because I was getting so immersed in new technologies.
And as a designer, and I love where the conversation is going, because you're talking about ceramics, and then you said that the silica is being used also in the microchips. So it's kind of like going, as you said, like very far in ancient times, and then going all the way to modern times, or the more. I don't know if there are modern times, but where we are living at the moment. How nature and technology go hand in hand? How do you see that combination of nature and technology going hand in hand through your perspective and lenses as a designer?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Strangely, maybe I haven't thought this through deeply, but I just remember, coming across a sort of Michelangelo sculpture in a book I was reading with Brian Eno. And, it was that old phrase of how Michelangelo believed he was removing material to discover the thing within. That was his sort of philosophical way of approaching a chunk of stone. I kind of feel that's all we're doing with nature, is that nature is, I mean, it's like, when people describe how long we've been on Earth in terms of a 24-hour clock, and we're basically a couple of minutes at the end of a 24-hour day. When you compare nature's impact on design, whether you consider it with a god, or whether it's sort of, just evolution and Darwinism is entirely your choice, but you can't refute the vastness and complexity of which it goes at things. And I just find that so often, we're almost sort of, I don't know, it seems almost arrogant sometimes that we use phrases like, we need to help Mother Nature. And I think that's kind of where we've kind of got everything upside down. That I won't swear on the podcast, but there's a rather immortal skit by George Carlin. I'm obviously not going to try and repeat what he said, because I'm not going to do it justice as a comic genius. But he was basically just meaning the arrogance that we would sort of suppose that nature is somehow, giving a damn about our existence on the earth. We're just a blink or another meteorite collision away from being completely erased, and it will start all over again. So this idea that we're somehow doing Mother Nature, and again, it's problematic that it's female, as if this sort of needy woman needs our help. It says a lot about sort of patriarchal norms and things like this, which we could discuss on a whole nother podcast.
Exactly.
But I guess to answer your question, I feel it is that Michelangelo of things, of that the more I've looked at even just things like AI and machine learning with vision, I've explained to kids that we just assume that our vision is the standard. Whereas if you take something like a mantis shrimp, it has an additional set of rods and cones in its eyes. It literally sees more of the electromagnetic spectrum than we do. And so it processes the world in a completely different way. And I feel that for me has been the really exciting jolt, is to realize that on the one hand, our bodies do something that is truly mind-bendingly complex, but at the same time, when we're trying to replicate it, as we often do, we anthropomorphize technology. It's weird that we keep putting cameras on things when you could also just run it in infrared and maybe it's going to work better, or you could run it in ultraviolet or sonar or any other type of scanning. And I feel that it's just something as humans we have to unlearn, is our own defaults. So sorry if that's a very long waffling thing, but I think that's why I like the tension of, comparing that ceramics has gone through a political thing, as China's, even the name China is was this tremendous powerhouse of trade and relevance. And yet I think it's Chris Miller's book, Chip Wars, is basically a modern update. And I love the fact that it's saying yet again, we are hopefully not going into real, bombs conflict with these sorts of things with Taiwan. But at the same time, this is where the geopolitics, I think, as anyone working in technology shouldn't be ignorant to, because these are forces that will ultimately govern the landscape of essentially human knowledge.
Yeah.
Without getting too much in a side digression, I was recently at Springer Nature in Berlin, and judging an innovation panel, and you realize how much that data is now. This phrase abundance often gets used, but actually there's also an equal pressure of people trying to basically manage and control and gatekeep data.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you have access to knowledge, but I think if you said what's going to happen in the next generation for who accesses what type and what quality of knowledge, that I think is going to be perhaps the next class divide. Not to sound too, Black Mirror about this, but I don't think knowledge will be equally distributed.
Well, it hasn't been equally distributed.
Yeah.
Nor has it been unbiased. And there's a project I'm working on with a student from Central St. Martin's around, essentially an answer to coded bias documentary, which I'm sure many of your audience will have obviously seen. So
yeah, my project from the masters was on biases.
Yeah. So
yeah, cognitive biases. Yeah.
It's the data and the part is quite interesting. So we refer to it as data obesity. It is where the abundance of data. But I think the leap from data to knowledge is not that simple, because there's I actually have a paper on it, which is in 1999, which is data with context provides information. And it's the ability to make a decision from that information that provides knowledge. So there's several layers. So just having data does not give us knowledge. So there's quite interesting. I mean, that comes from philosophy, but it's also a model that's embedded into understanding knowledge-based systems, expert systems, and coming from that perspective. But just going back to your clay project for just one moment, because I think there's something really interesting in there.
Of course.
I mean, there's many things that's interesting in there.
Sorry, I went off on a tangent. No, my one.
Because they're all really interesting comments and interesting insights. With the tracing the provenance of the clay, so the children were getting used to understanding, going into nature to understand where the sand is coming from, and I guess moving that all the way through to understanding how you can build a material, how you can manufacture a material. And that, going to your comment, your tangent comment, but I don't think it's tangential, on geopolitics, is actually really relevant. So if you move it around to manufacturing, and some of the questions that we're seeing is, how do you trace the materials in a product? So there's things being discussed such as digital passports, so you can just trace the material of each type of material, particularly for long-standing products such as buildings. Grenfell Tower, which many people will know about, understanding that material and reclaiming that material, and then also looking at the degradation of that material and how it can be reused, is an example of an area where digital passports would be interesting. But also, there's with geopolitics, the supply chains can be suddenly changed dramatically. So we saw issues around semiconductors in the UK due to a few of the political situations that are currently going on. So that lesson that you're teaching them is actually a really important lesson for later in life, and there's still no answers in there, and it's much more complex, and it's in there. So I think that's quite an interesting point. And I was wondering if this is a good point to switch to how you've designed solutions for single users. So you've worked a little bit with them, well, not a little bit. You've done a series of programs with the BBC on Big Life Fix with Simon Reeves, and that starts in a different place. So you've talked a bit about materials, working with a big company. That starts thinking about a single user, a single person in there. And we sort of looked through some of your projects in there, and you have one with Josh, a young child with blindness. And I was wondering if we could take that as an example to think through how do you start when you're thinking about design for one person? And what would you need to do to scale that up to other people who are blind? My mother-in-law is blind, for example. So I've often been thinking about solutions coming as a designer in that.
So yeah, I guess one of the things, strangely, I was just having this conversation with a bunch of students earlier this week, and one of the things I sort of feel I've always tried to be very transparent with my work, warts and all. And so even though, you know, again, this wasn't the TV show editing out the bits that would make us look silly. It's just you're literally condensing what
Yeah.
was. I should also mention Ruby Steele was basically co-designer with me on this. And so, you know, massive credit to her, but also another coder, Akram Hussein, who helped with a lot of the tech side of things. And what in the write up I sort of did, I was actually sort of pretty open about the fact that we started off trying to change Josh to be more capable of navigating. Now, you'll know from your background, but just maybe to explain for users, that would be what's referred to as the medical model of disability, which not to say any doctor or anyone would phrase it this callously, but the presumption is that the individual is broken and so they need a fix. So
Yeah.
side discussion of even the name Big Life Fix was hotly debated, and it's a very moot point, the word fix. But where we were going is that the end solution, we realized we wanted to use what was called the social model of disability
Yeah.
and lean into that more, which is to say that the environment or the circumstances, or indeed society's social constructs, disable an individual. So how can you make that you know, more inclusive? And so that's when I think suddenly inclusive doesn't feel like, oh, I've got to reluctantly, you know, include this for someone because it's going to cost me more money. It's saying actually there's a bigger societal benefit that sometimes comes from designing from the individual that actually benefits more people than you originally expected. So, case in point, we designed a playground which had tactile paving, and we called them the yellow brick roads. So, if for anyone who isn't in London or whatever, our tactile paving had the little knobbly bits on and they're bright yellow. And so we used that as a feature that just made a really fun way for kids who even were sighted to create games. Obviously, Josh couldn't see the yellow, but he could feel the tactileness under his feet, and so he could still play the same game. But the benefit to the rest of the people who weren't blind was that this was just a really fun way to engage. And at either end of these roads, there were pads which, when you jumped on them, they would play a sound. And so it meant that you could say, well, we're on the whale road, and it would play whale song at either side, or we're on the horse road, and it would have, you know, a whinnying horse at either end. And so it became this thing that elevated the sort of playability of what we were creating,
Mhm.
rather than sort of the how do I say this delicately? If I don't have to say it delicately, because I've just been to the V&A's design and disability exhibition, and someone said F star 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 pity, and I think that's actually a really important point, is that a lot of people with disability, what often rankles them is being pitied.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put my disability of dyslexia on the same level of intensity and limitation as Joss's, obviously, but I know even just on a very small degree, I don't feel my difference is something that should, you know, generate pity. It should generate discussion you
Mm.
know, of what could be done differently, and how those things can be an asset, not just a withering sigh of, oh, that's going to be more expensive. And I think, case in point, you see some progressive cities where they've built, you know, things like curb cuts. Yes, it's good for wheelchairs, but having lived in Hong Kong for some time, there's the amount of people just shifting deliveries around who use those same curb cuts. They installed them irrespective of whether there's a wheelchair user that needs them, because they're a really good design addition. And I kind of feel that when I'm trying to explain to students who are sometimes scratching their head going, okay, you spent all this time and energy designing something for just one person. There's whatever it is, 7, 8 billion of us. how's that going to help the planet? And I feel that it's important to make the point that sometimes it's about nudging that first domino and trusting that it will lead to an effect which is bigger than just Josh. It's bigger than just me. It's bigger than Ruby. And that for
How
me is
could you
sorry. Yeah.
sorry, how could you adopt I love what you said about if you design for one person, then you're hoping that more people will adopt it, and you've
Yeah.
seen that result. But how could you, for the people that are listening and for decision makers, how could you make the case to adopt these solutions more widely?
Do you mean more widely in the financial incentive for doing it, or you mean the ethical, or both?
Well, the ethical should be there. I think more the
Yeah.
financial. What would be? How could we make the case that these solutions are not? Even if people think that they are only for one person, they are not. So
Yeah.
how could we make decision makers think more widely in terms of adopting the solutions that are going to be supporting and helping more people instead of thinking, oh, this is only for disabilities?
I got to be honest. I think it's a sort of really glacial thing is the honest
Mm.
truth. I would love to say that, honestly, I've done a DEI talk for investment bankers and day traders, which, without being too stereotypical, you can imagine that's a tough crowd, as they say,
Yeah, DI,
to get them.
disability
Yeah, sorry,
inclusion,
sorry.
right?
Exactly. So going into a room that is extremely conscious of making money as quickly as
Yeah.
possible wasn't necessarily thinking about the gender ratios.
Mhm.
But my provocation was that essentially when you look at the statistics around young women going through school, now they've sort of taken the first place of not just, it used to be that maths was the outlier, that boys still had the edge on that, and now that even that has gone. So girls are ostensibly much more academic for the age. We can get into a discussion, but the point is the data point of, if you look at women's sort of economic mobility, all of these sorts of things means that you might have been designing a product thinking everything's fine, it works, why change it? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But when you look at the future roadmap of what's coming down the pipeline, which is that women are having, more
Yeah.
agency, they are not beholden to a man where divorce is the end of literally their life. All of these things culminate in saying that you're probably going to have a very powerful and lucrative business case to say that your products need to work equally well for women as well as men. Now, coming back to that point, I use case studies like that to basically make the point that sometimes you start out on a journey thinking about, well, how do we create I'm sure we've all got our smartphones in front of us. I'm sure most people take for granted that they can send a text message with one hand. That I can't guarantee that it was generated, all the sort of swipe text and all these sorts of things, because someone said, well, the usability case is we've got to design for someone with one hand. But actually, this is where you get into the social model of disability, of that, let's say a pregnant mother carrying a bag of shopping whilst having to send a text or, get a
And our
taxi.
hands are smaller
Exactly. Hands are smaller. And
and
so,
different. So, yeah, and we're
exactly.
half of the population. So, yeah,
Yeah, so
to
I
your
realize
point,
we're
exactly.
probably preaching to the converted here onto why it's important ethically, but maybe the bit that the audience is regularly grappling with, which I know I am, is again maybe coming full circle back to where we started this, is I think it's about providing those business cases of where it wasn't about just virtue signaling and do-gooderism. It was saying this is genuine innovation that actually led to growth, and profits ultimately for companies who embrace this way of innovating. So I think it's not actually, we're not short of case studies that show. It's just the scary bit for companies is that they often think, but you're showing us all the things that were successful, and we know that the failure rate of that is 90%.
Mhm.
In which case, then you kind of have to have a grown-up discussion about, are you a fast follower or are you a leader?
Yeah.
And if you're a fast follower, to break down what that means, is that isn't someone who's taking the big risks on innovation. Whereas, love them or hate them, Apple is still very much, to give an example that's very easy, they are still trying to push new types of things all the time, which means lots of their things will fail. And that's kind of their brand, and that's part of the proposition and the price point. So I think these things, I think what we're often dealing with is, I find as a consultant, is trying to find the most ambitious thing I can get a company to do that is likely to have a holistic effect on not just innovating in one area or one category or one product, but that invigorates the entire business and the entire range of the products that they do. So I think if you start from that place of seeing how an innovation can also be amortized and otherwise spread so that the cost is lower throughout an entire system, then I think that's also how you can have quite groundbreaking ideas that are good for society, but still are lucrative in terms of, the business model.
That is a really good takeaway and sort of lesson from you. And perhaps it's time for us to wrap up.
Just noticed the hour, yes.
And I think that's a really good, useful insight. So I think on top of that, I would add the insights that I've gained from today and what we've talked about. The first thing, we talked about AI and ethics, and really the use of AI being local and specific to the domain, and using things such as edge processing to reduce the impact on energy and providing solutions. So that ethical use of AI really is the choice of AI for the problem it's solving, and the debate around whether that outweighs the sustainable and ethical impact on the benefits being perceived. So that's one. And then the last one, I'm going to talk about the last one together, because that's really inclusive design, and the idea of starting with Josh, and what you brought in there is the model of social model of disability, which is a really useful model of adapting everything around you rather than considering the person as requiring support, or starting from a different place. And that, starting there, the idea of showcasing the playground that Josh had hopefully makes that visible to other schools, to other environments. For that to be adopted as a standard part in every school requires, I think, two things, which are very similar to your sustainability argument. So either it's a driver that's a social, economical driver, or it's regulations. It's the carrot or the stick. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's where we are. And perhaps fortunately too, things aren't idealistic. You need sustainable models. And I very much have that resonance that, to push sustainability, you need to have it alongside economical value, or you need a regulation so that we recognize that's something everybody needs to do and provide a level playing field for everybody. And then from the other project, we talked about the importance of provenance and learning where materials come from and their traceability. And that can carry through from the example from children education, but all the way to full-scale products, to buildings, and understanding the impact of every single material that's in there and the supply chain through there. So thank you very much, Jude. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Likewise.
Thank you. We're excited that in the next episode, we're going to bring Irene McLeese. She's the co-founder and a successful entrepreneur working with intelligent cycle lights and adopting new and innovative approaches to selling data. Thank you.
Got to tune in for that. Sounds great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you think, or if you have an idea for a future guest or topic, at www.decodedpodcast.com.
Don't forget to give us a rating wherever you listen, and follow us on TikTok and Instagram at decoded.podcast. See you!